Do you think then that people have almost this PTSD when it comes to bubble because we've lived through the dot-com bubble bursting in 2000, the housing bubble of 2007, 2008. Do you think that when people, that these concerns are perhaps overblown because when they hear that, they remember those, pretty dark times?
Yes, I think that it is somewhat overblown. I think the problem is that people are feeling the emotions, but they're not looking at the numbers. And the numbers that they need to look at have to do with the amount of money being borrowed compared to the amount of equity in the companies that are borrowing and the amount of cash in the companies that are borrowing the money. And what caused the collapses and the big downward trends were basically too much borrowing. And the best example of this was the 2007 2008 collapse when subprime mortgages were securitized, so they were owned around the world. And so, the values collapsed around the world. There was not enough equity to support that. And that is not happening right now with the generative AI situation. And it didn't really even happen as badly during the dot-com bubble. It did affect some publicly traded companies that were building fiber optic networks that borrowed all this money, were losing money. The dot-com collapse happened in March of 2000, and there was no more money to invest in these companies.
I like what you said about people are feeling their emotions and they're not looking at the numbers. And the numbers in Nvidia's Q3 earnings report, I mean, they were stellar. They were better than anticipated. Revenue is up year over year by over 60%. When you see this earnings report, what does that indicate to you about the future of the AI boom?
Well, I think it has a lot of legs. I definitely think it has a lot of legs. One of the things that I've been skeptical of is whether there is this thing which I call the killer app. I think you're probably familiar with the concept of the killer app. I mean, probably before your time, when PCs first came out, people didn't know why to buy a PC, and then along came the electronic spreadsheet, and that was the killer app. That and word processing software. That's why you needed to buy a PC. And maybe you remember the iPod. The iPod initially was not selling much, but then along came the iTunes store, and that became the killer app. The revenue of the iPod more than tripled after the iTunes store came out, and that was the killer app for the iPod. And so the question is, what is the killer app for AI? I mean, I was at a conference last week in San Francisco called the Cerebral Valley AI Conference, which was absolutely fantastic. And I was in this discussion group, and I was asking the question, what is the killer app for AI? And there were maybe 15 people around this little circle, and basically nobody answered the question. There was no answer to the question. So I find that interesting. I mean, I've seen research from MIT that says that 95% of AI experiments or AI pilots have not generated any meaningful return on investment. So ultimately, this whole thing has to demonstrate it can generate a return on investment from the companies that are buying the services of building and training AI models from these cloud services providers that are making all this investment. If that does not happen, then eventually the companies are going to stop buying all those cloud services and stop subscribing to all these AI chatbots. So that's a bit of a question in my mind. However, having said that, when I was at this conference, I saw many companies that were growing very fast, had lots of revenues because they were providing real value by wrapping ChatGPT and these AI chatbots into industry-specific knowledge of how to use that technology to make companies able to operate more efficiently because of the ability, for example, to read through and digest and summarize hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents very efficiently. That to me may be the killer app of AI, is the ability to kind of save huge amounts of time in just going through so much data, so many documents, and figure out what it means and figure out what to do about it much more quickly. So it basically makes people much smarter, much faster. It's also great for coding. It definitely allows people to write code without having to know how to code. They can do vibe coding, which essentially I did some vibe coding myself. There's this company called Replit, and they were there, and I used Replit about a year ago to build an app that would allow me to imagine what it would look like if I put a piece of furniture from a catalog into my living room. And I just described the concept, and it created the app. So this is vibe coding. This is something that makes it possible to do things with software without knowing how to write all the code.